Good afternoon. Welcome to the 2024 Annual Conference and Book Fair in Kansas City, Missouri. I am Stephanie Vanderslice, a member of the AWP Board of Directors. Here is a visual description of myself. I am a short, white woman with graying hair and a ponytail and a multicolored tunic. The Association of Writers and Writing Programs is a small but mighty nonprofit organization that amplifies the voices of writers and the academic programs and organizations that serve them, all the while championing diversity and excellence in creative writing. I am a member of AWP's Board of Directors, but first and foremost, I am a member of AWP. Membership with AWP provides me with writing resources year-round. But just as importantly, it allows me to support other writers, especially those who are just starting out. My membership dues also help writers find meaningful careers and publication opportunities and make services like the Writer-to-Writer Mentorship Program and the AWP HBCU Fellowship Program possible. If you aren't already, I invite you to become a member today. We are delighted to bring you this event today. I'd like to acknowledge and thank all of the conference sponsors and the literary partner hosting this event, the National Book Critics Circle. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking all of our conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. Now, before we start, I need to do some brief housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones. Remember, there is no flash photography allowed during the presentation. Respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessibility needs. Please give the authors about 10 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your book signed. Lastly, we ask that you please be aware of your fellow attendees who may have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at 240-269-6635. Please also be aware of those with invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of accommodation. Thank you. And now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome J. Howard Rosier, who will introduce this fantastic event.
Good afternoon. I am J. Howard Rosier, Chair of the Criticism Committee at the National Book Critics Circle, and I'm delighted to be here to represent the organization as we launch our 50th anniversary. I would like to thank the AWP board and staff for all the work that they've done in creating this event. I would also like to thank our esteemed panelists, Margo, Jefferson, Camille, Dungy, and Walton, Muyumba, who I'll introduce more thoroughly in just a short while. Lastly, I would like to thank Jane Ciabattari, the NBCC Events VP, who has coordinated the NBCC's literary partnership again this year, and whose guidance and example I've relied on closely in planning this discussion. The NBCC was founded in 1974 to honor outstanding writing and foster a national conversation about reading, criticism, and literature. We're an all-volunteer nonprofit, an organization Toni Morrison once called a wild faculty of sorts. During this 50th anniversary year, the NBCC will be collaborating with book festivals, libraries, bookstores, and other institutions throughout the country, creating live and virtual events to honor The art of literary criticism, the power of our award-winning authors and finalists, the contributions of our dozens of volunteer board members over the years, and the importance of reading and writing in these times. This year's National Book Critics Circle Awards ceremony will also be live and live-streamed in New York on March 21st at the New School. We'll announce the winners of our awards in 8 categories and honor the winners of our special awards, including Washington Post member critic Becca Rothfeld, Judy Blume, and the American Library Association. Please come by Book Fair booth 1624 to learn more, to meet NBCC members and board members, and to learn about our Emerging Critics program. You can also sign up for our weekly Critical Notes newsletter, which highlights work by member critics. And if you're interested in joining, you can do so here at the book fair or online at bookcritics.org. Back in 2018, at the now extinct Book Expo America, I attended a talk hosted by the governing body on which I now serve, called The Crisis in Book Reviewing. Kate Tuttle, who's then the NBCC's president, outlined an environment that is all too familiar. Critics going to the same schools, writing for the same magazines, paradoxically assuming to speak for the culture at large. This insularity was feeding into a credibility problem amongst people who are aspiring to enter into the cultural field. It's one thing to state claim to personal taste, quite another to assume a level of taste that very few people have access to, and the gulf between who had access to culture and who was shut out was growing wider. Fast forward to 2024, and the literary world appears to have flipped to a different side of the same coin. Criticism, which was once a vaunted and gate-kept position, is now a mere commodity, and not a high trading one. The majority of reviewers operate on a freelance basis, and rates vary wildly. Meanwhile, in inadvertent ghettoization, the split between reviewers and literary essayists has confused the issue with regard to what venues publish criticism in the first place. There was once also a hope that general interest publications would recognize the vastness of the reading public and publish more criticism. Yet for every success story, there are near catastrophes and huge chasms. Astra, Catapult, Book Forum. The closures and callous dismissals serve as bookmarks in the story of how precarious their life in criticism has become. The foremost case was an upheaval caused by the sale of Art Forum, the most prestigious art criticism brand, to a conglomerate, and when weighed alongside the downsizing of Pitchfork, the shuttering and revival of Jezebel, and the mass layoffs at the LA Times, to maintain a singular concern with books coverage obfuscates a much larger issue. The demand for meaningful engagement has no bearing on whether financial benefactors are willing to supply it, or whether an increasingly small pool of freelance assignments and staff positions provide enough space for both you and the person next to you. In August, I wrote a piece for the Poetry Foundation about Roger Reeves' Dark Days, a book that I respected but was unsettled by. It felt like a version of other good but unsettling books I'd read since the summer of 2020. The phrase I landed on to describe the trend, discomfort autopsy, gestured toward the deep sense of shame at having failed, yet again, to make society just, or, alternately, at having failed to hold the line against social disorder. But the trouble with a failed society is that everything becomes an elegy, or a dead end. So authors survey our expired civilization, poking and prodding at its viscera while working toward a cause of death. I stand by the observation, but perhaps I was right in the wrong way. After all, it doesn't do much good to treat a book about malaise with an equal amount of dejection. But a lack of optimism among critics, not in criticism as an act, but as a viable and sustainable vocation, is a problem seldom discussed. Even by those of us who have made it, there is a presupposition that it has gotten worse, or that it's more difficult to navigate, or that the money is rarely, if ever, enough. It is not my intention to quarrel with the truth of these claims, but rather to consider another paradox, that plenty of people are still lining up to write criticism. If nothing else, I hope that this discussion narrows the gap between awareness of the current environment and a willingness to think our way through it. I'm joined by Camille Dungy, University Distinguished Professor at Colorado State University, who is the author of Soil, 4 collections of poetry, including Tropic Cascade, and the essay collection, Guidebook to Relative Strangers, a finalist for the National Book Critics Criticism Award. Dungy's other honors include a 2021 Academy of American Poets Fellowship, a 2019 Guggenheim Fellowship, an American Book Award, and fellowships from the NEA in prose and poetry. I am also pleased to welcome Margo Jefferson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism, who previously served as book and arts critic for Newsweek and the New York Times. Her writing has appeared in, among other publications, Vogue, New York Magazine, The Nation, and Guernica. Her memoir, Negroland, received the National Book Critics Circle for autobiography. She's also the author of On Michael Jackson and a professor in writing at the Columbia University School of the Arts. On stage with me is Muyumba, Ruth N. Hall's associate professor in the Department of English at Indiana University. A former criticism chair of the National Book Critics Circle, he has published in The Atlantic, The Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times, The Nation, The New York Review of Books, Oxford American, and Virginia Quarterly Review, among other outlets. He has also co-edited and wrote the introduction to John Edgar Wyman's collection, You Make Me Love You, Selected Stories 1981 to 2018. Muyumba is at work on various creative and critical book projects. Please welcome our panelists. I've asked each of them to read from a selection of their critical work that speaks to the question, where's literary criticism headed? We'll then discuss whatever direction we have gone in. The discussion will be followed by a Q&A session and a book signing, and the book's purchase will be accompanied by book plates signed by the authors participating virtually. It's probably easiest to start alphabetically, so with that, I will turn it over to Camille.
Hi there. How is everybody? I wish I could be with you in person, but you don't want me with you in person. I have the flu, so that's no fun. I thought today that I would enter this question through my engagement with criticism as a category as connected with the National Book Critics Circle, which, among other things, returns to an award ceremony that I very clearly remember. The year my essay collection, Guidebook to Relative Strangers, Journeys into Race, Motherhood, and History, was a finalist for the NBCC Criticism Award. And in his preliminary statement about the award category, the presenting judge, who I will say is not represented on this panel today, just in case you're wondering, the presenting judge said that he didn't really know what the criticism category was, only that it seemed to be a place to put books that weren't quite biography, weren't quite memoir, weren't quite straight nonfiction. I took him to be saying this was the misfits category, the island of lost toys. And I smiled, because I too am large, I too contain multitudes. What a bore it would be to write work that could be so easily contained. Where is criticism going? Perhaps where it inevitably always must, expanding ever and exponentially outward, absorbing all it can as it goes. Hypertextual, intertextual, genre bending, observational splendor. I'll take it all. I'm going to read a sample from my new book, Soil, The Story of a Black Mother's Garden, which is even less easily categorizable than my last book of prose, but which tries to think very carefully, and I'd say critically, about the dynamic world that we live in today. This is not what I thought I'd be writing. In the proposal for the fellowship that brought me the time to write a new book, I made it clear that I wanted to write about my yard, the crocus, the patches of purple iris, a cluster of Mexican sunflowers, Tithonia, that volunteered in our back garden in 2018. At first, I suspected the Tithonia was an undesirable weed. Then they blossomed into flowers so gorgeous, I brought friends to the house to see them. 9 feet tall and topped with orange blooms like a cross between a zinnia and a gerbera daisy. The tithonia was wonderfully unexpected and perfectly suited to the corner where they grew. I wanted to spend a year thinking about the soil that surrounded me, what grew up from it, and why. But even before I found myself overseeing my daughter's remote education during the pandemic, I was troubled by the seeming improbability of a Black mother writing about nature. Before 2020 became 2020, I reread Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, a book that, for myriad justifiable reasons, has remained a favorite for many. Oh, I love that book, one woman exclaimed when I told her what I'd been reading. I traveled to the university where the woman taught. We were on our way to one of her classes. Have you read it recently? I asked. I guess I haven't. You might want to. I wondered if her response would shift on returning to the book. Over the course of a year, Annie Dillard, the book's author, takes long walks beside the creek that runs near her home. That's basically the plot. When I told my colleague I reread Dillard's book, I actually meant I listened to an audio version while completing household chores. This is a way to feed my hunger for reading while also completing the work that needs to be done. While folding laundry, sweeping the kitchen, cooking the evening meal, I listened to Dillard's book, feeling as if I were off in a field of unmown grass somewhere in Virginia. Dillard's many quiet hours spent walking along Tinker Creek led to lengthy reveries about perception and philosophy and something akin to monastic ecstasy. Her language is sublime, and I often got caught up in its reveries. Dillard's book, which, like me, is nearing its 50th birthday, has been popular for so long, writers use it as shorthand when they profess a desire to undertake the type of project demanding they stay close to home and look very closely at their surroundings. Back in 2018, I had lunch with an editor in Manhattan. I felt so fancy, drinking a noontime glass of Chardonnay with a New York editor. "What are you writing next?" she asked. "I want to write my Pilgrim at Tinker Creek." The editor looked at me skeptically, as if assessing the magnitude of both my ego and my aptitude. Her bright face briefly dimmed ashen with doubt before arranging into a more professionally supportive posture. And she said, "Sounds like you're asking a lot of yourself." From my journal, February 4, 2020. You must find your own quiet center of your life and write from that. This quote comes from a 1908 letter the writer Sarah Orner Jewett sent to one of my favorite novelists, Willa Cather, after which such gems from Cather's pen. She wrote a novel nearly every 18 months from 1912 to 1931, and she published still more beyond that. Some of my favorite depictions of the American plains and the West. How grateful I am to Cather for her patient, unflinching depictions of the landscapes I love and the people who live here. I have been reading Cather since high school, returning when I need to recenter myself in the world. During the first year of my daughter's life, late at night while I nursed her and tried to resolve myself to myself, I reread my Antonia on my backlit phone. I needed something of how Cather's narrator, Jim, describes the girl Antonia, how the Western landscape shaped Antonia. I felt grounded by the book's rendering of a woman coming into herself. At some point in the future, maybe I'll write about what it means that so many of Cather's narrators are men, or the fact that neither Cather nor Jewett married, or why neither of them nor Annie Dillard at the time she wrote Pilgrim of Tinker Creek raised children. What paths their lives took instead. There are so many reasons women do and do not marry, why we may or may not have children. Too many for me to write easily about this aspect of any woman's life but my own. For now, I simply want to say that though many aspects of my life are substantially different from Jewett's and Cather's, I am thankful for whatever role Jewett's advice played in setting Cather's pen into motion. But I worry, what if there can be no quiet at my life center or anywhere near? Upheaval is a word rooted in the soil. It suggests the act of turning up the earth to make room for sowing. After upheaval, new life is revealed. Earthworms, millipedes, the sow bug's name isn't so much about the pig like look of the insect as it is about the fact that the upturning of earth that comes with sowing and planting tends to bring sow bugs to light. I never saw myself as an animal so much as when I hunched on all fours to labor with my girl, or when I nursed her, my daughter's newborn suckling frenzy more feral than anything I ever held so close. I was a mammal mother, a female beast. Since then, I have not fully returned to the independent person I believed I was before. A family of blue jays nests in a yard behind our house and wing through our airspace most days, flashing their brilliant feathers. In the pandemic shaded September of 2020, there were also many hundred thousands of acres of wildfire burning close by. On one of the smokiest days, when the skies looked like the day after we practiced for in the nuclear threatened 1980s of my childhood, the blue jays flashed across our yard looking quite plain. I had to point the birds out to my daughter, who did not recognize them. Untrue to the name by which we've come to know them, the birds we saw looked only white and gray. The jay's feathers carry no blue pigment. Our eyes trick us into seeing that shade when light reflects off the birds. On that red-orange day, when the light was so altered, we had to train ourselves to see the birds anew. Maybe this is what it means for me, for this Black woman, this mother, the subdivision dweller with a little yard she tends, to say I write about the wide, wild world. Maybe it's just a matter of figuring out what can be seen in this light. Thank you so much.
That was wonderful. We'll now hear from Margo Jefferson.
Ah, can you all hear me? Yes? Yes. Thank you. That was wonderful. I am very happy to be, albeit at a distance, from a distance. I've been struggling with viruses as well. Very happy to be here amongst you three. I am going to read some excerpts from my most recent book, Constructing a Nervous System, and from an essay that I wrote called A Critic Tracks Herself. All of this is from 2022. I stood in a bright, harsh light. The stage was bare. This is how the book opens. I extended my arm, flung, hurled it out, pointed an accusatory finger, then turned to an unseen audience and declared, "This is the woman with only one childhood." It was part of my night's dream work, and I was rattled when I woke up, for I'd been addressing myself. My tone was harsh, and my outstretched arm with its accusing finger had the force of that moment in melodrama when the villain, hitherto successful in his schemes to ruin the heroine, is revealed, condemned, and readied for punishment. I understood what I had to do. At the end of his stage show, Bill Bojangles Robinson would look up at the lighting booth and shout, "Give me a light, my color." Pause, then blackout. When the light returned, I knew it was time to construct another nervous system. My nervous system is an assemblage. My nervous system is my structure of recombinant thoughts, memories, feelings, sensations, and words. Repeat after me. It's time to construct another nervous system. You write criticism, you write memoir. What will be your tactics, strategies, instruments for constructing this nervous system? I keep carping and fussing, rearing up against the words critic and criticism, such august, temperate words. They make me think Gertrude Stein was right, that nouns are boring because all they do is name things. Quote, and naming things is all right when you want to call a roll, but is it good for anything else? When you're thrilled by a petticoat, a flying buttress, a sound chamber of notes and syllables, when an idea makes you feel as if the top of your head were being taken off, then abandon your too-temperate prose zone and keep writing criticism. As for memoir, I keep attaching adjectives to it. Cultural memoir, temperamental memoir. What makes me so anxious? I want memoir and criticism to merge. Can they? And if so, how? Read on. There's no escaping the primal stuff of memory and experience. Dramatize it, analyze it, amend it academically, remake it intentionally. Call it temperamental autobiography. Now, the opening of a piece I wrote, published in Yale Review, that is called A Critic Tracks Herself. I generally trust my reading self and my writing self. I think well of both their capacities to imagine, associate, discern, to respond instinctively and analytically. Lately, though, I've been questioning my writing self more pointedly. I keep scanning my prose for glib discontinuities that I almost manage to disguise as artful transitions. Overdone solemnity, superficial brightness, placating charm. I've come to see these trick effects as signs that I'm avoiding something, an unruly doubt, a confounding thought, or maybe just settling into an approach, a tone, a structure that has rewarded me in the past, even if it may no longer suffice. In particular, I am considering how I write about race, gender, and class, my methods, my choices, my intentions, and is about the best word. How I write through is more accurate, through the particulars of my race, my gender, my social class, and those of others. How do I present, interpret for myself, then persuade, delight, provoke readers with these particulars? Now I'm asking, how can I use these categories and identities to keep my thoughts supple and my feelings bold? Or the reverse, to keep my thoughts bold and my feelings supple? What I'll read now is from Constructing a Nervous System also, which is a kind of collage of criticism. It's a little one of the oddities, one of the little orphans. It's a collage of criticism, memoir, and speculation/fantasy at parts, imagination, we'll say. What I'm going to read follows a long, somewhat tormented section on Willa Cather, whom I have also loved for many years, but found while over a number of years I was teaching Song of the Lark, I found myself contending with certain racial idolatries of whiteness and of the highest aspects, as she saw it, of white culture. So I contended with all of these feelings and facts throughout this long essay, and what follows, what I'm going to read now, comes right after. And I call it an entr'acte. This confessing and reckoning have exhausted me. I need an imaginative break. I need to restore myself. Stage encounters with Black artists who know how talented they and complicated they were, and who insisted that the world know it too. I need speculation instead of argument. Last year, when I was getting ready to teach several Baldwin essays, I sent away for the December 1966 issue of Playboy so I could read a long interview with him. The same issue turned out to have an interview with Sammy Davis Jr. And suddenly they came together in my mind like two stars making a one-night-only joint appearance. Baldwin using his voice and body to represent the collective Black experience. Davis absorbing that collective experience into his singular voice and body. They are born 1 year apart, Jimmy in 1924, Sammy in 1925. To be a chosen messenger for your people, it seems one must begin as a gifted child, chosen by adults. You're Sammy Davis Jr., and you have been a song and dance virtuoso in theaters, clubs, and films since you were 3 years old. You are James Baldwin, and you have been writing since you were in elementary school. Having a play performed by your class when you're 9.5 isn't the same as being the title character in a 20-minute film titled Rufus Jones for President when you're 8. Sammy did that. But you keep writing plays and songs, and one of them wins you a congratulatory letter from Mayor LaGuardia. By the age of 14, you're a Harlem evangelist with a pulpit and an audience of enthralled parishioners. Whose little boy are you? Bishop Rosa Artemis Horn asked you, little Baldwin, when you were preparing to be saved. Why, yours, of course, you answered. That yours would come to mean everyone's, everyone with eyes and ears to see. The white American would demand an uncanny Black man, uncannily gifted and uncannily willing to shoulder, wrap himself in, become one with the needs and desires of American Blacks and whites. The forbidden hung over you both in secret. You, Baldwin, were a homosexual. You, Davis, a heterosexual who attracted and pursued white women. You were both skinny and short. Jimmy, 5'6", Sammy, 5'5". You were considered odd-looking. Jimmy, you had pop eyes and a nose still considered Negro broad. Sammy, you had a wide forehead that sloped into a long nose, which drew attention downward to your lower lip. After that 1954 car crash, you had a glass eye, too. This gave those who still craved a last chance to see your gifts as only compensation for what you so obviously lacked. It gave them an excuse for what you to see. This gave those who still craved it a last chance to see your gifts as compensation for what you so obviously lacked. The superiority of the entitled normal. Let Baldwin use we again and again to implode the cognitive certainties of race. Let Davis declare that every time he walks out on a stage, he's swaggering through the saloon door of a rough and rowdy town to prove he's the fastest gun in the West. Both with a portmanteau of diction and accents, Anglo-New York theater, Jewish and Black vaudeville, queer, dandy, hetero swinger, lofty evangelist, breezy nightclub MC, all to conquer, persuade, instruct, uplift, arouse, titillate, intimidate, exhilarate, to prove their value to the world, to prove our value to the world. Baldwin's words. I'm bound to question an ethic or a way of life or a system of reality which has nearly destroyed me and which obviously intends to destroy my children. One begins to feel despairing, one begins to feel foolish, and one begins to dig beneath the bequeathed realities in the hope of arriving at a new coherence and a new strength, in the hope, in fact, of being released from an incipient schizophrenia. But at that moment, the moment one begins to pull away in order to see, one is accused of thinking black. But I don't really know what thinking black means, except that it seems to pose a threat to people who think, I suppose, white. Sammy Davis Jr. writes, I always go on stage anticipating what people out there may be feeling against me emotionally. I want to rob them of what they're sitting there thinking. Negro, with all the accompanying cliches. Ever since I recognized what prejudice is, I've tried to fight it away, and the only weapon I could use was my talent. Way back when I was learning the business, I had no education, no power, no influence. Entertaining was the only way I had to change prejudice thinking. They learned early in life, if you can't be free, be a prodigy. Thank you.
Thank you, that was beautiful. We'll now turn it over to Walton Muyumba.
Do you think I can stand up?
If you want, yeah.
Stand up instead of use the mic. Never follow geniuses. So I'm going to stand up to distract you from how I'm about to diffuse things a little bit. Thank you both for reading from your works. I wrote up a little statement before I get to a short excerpt of my own failed effort, and I'll explain a little bit as I get there. I took up the question a little more forthrightly here to gauge which direction American literary criticism might be taking. We may need to glance over our shoulders, fashion a historical narrative about terrain traversed and potential refueling stops overlooked, bypassed, or altogether rejected. For instance, 4 decades have passed since Terry Eagleton closed his book-length essay, The Function of Criticism, with this declaration: modern criticism was born of a struggle against the absolutist state. Unless its future is now defined as a struggle against the bourgeois state, criticism might have no future at all. Have we managed, lo, these 4 decades since the era of Thatcherism and Reaganomics, to support and empower a broad cadre of critics who rail against and resist the bourgeois state? Though I can think of some figures who I believe have been crucial resistant critics of the last half-century, generally speaking, American public literary criticism has not been as aesthetically dynamic, intellectually incisive, or politically radical as it could or should have been. Largely, this failure, I think, stems from our critical culture being, like the rest of American publishing, emphatically, stubbornly racially segregated. As Elizabeth Mendez-Berry and Shi Hui Yang argued in their 2019 New York Times editorial, The Dominance of the White Male Critic, critics of color are much less visible than white reviewers. A dynamic, they explain, shaped by the perception that the opinions of people of color are not universal. We seem very comfortable governing our American lives through segregation, amnesia, and white supremacist policies, attitudes, and cultural practices. We maintain our segregated national life, I think, in order to forget those moments when critics of color have forwarded alternative social and cultural arrangements that could have led us collectively toward achieving the country, as Baldwin once put it. Writers from so-called racially marginalized communities are uniquely situated to interrogate American writing artistically while simultaneously holding the bourgeois state to account. Historically, American people of color employed literary and cultural criticism as the serrated edge of their multifaceted, large-scale political movements for equal protection under the law and economic parity. They continue in this struggle to this very moment. However, in 21st century American journalism, where every dollar matters, editors seem unwilling and unable to enlist and develop critics of color. See the recent Los Angeles Times dismissals, which affected 20% of the newsroom, disproportionately eliminating young Black, Asian, Indigenous, and Latinx journalists, including the culture writer Susie Exposito. I get it. Last in, first out. Writers of color and critics are often first up on the chopping block when newsroom cutbacks are in the offing. Coverage of the margins and criticism aren't saleable, click-inducing products. The best critics reject commercialization in favor of generating and disseminating new ideas about human experience through attentive and rigorous examination of the arts. And critics of color do all this while forwarding concepts and practices for reimagining, even revolutionizing, the cultures of collective American life. Not only can they write toward the utopian universal future, the cultural particulars of the very communities that they come from are always already imagining the ethical, philosophical, and artistic contours of that elsewhere to come. Rigoberto Gonzalez's poetry criticism points me in that direction. In the introduction to his collected critical pieces, Gonzalez argues that poets of color often have shared political affinities and desires that play out in their works. And critics of color, like Gonzalez himself, can put those works in conversation, can identify the aesthetic practices and political prospects churning within the poems themselves while describing how readers might reshape their own lives through literary engagement. That kind of living through criticism and literary culture might lead us away from the bourgeois status quo and toward new coalitions and a new future for our national life. I tried to get at something like this in a failed essay that I wrote last year about Chad L. Williams's W.E.B. Du Bois and the Wounded World. Possibly that essay wasn't good enough, or its freshness had faded by the time the editor went through draft number 300. But I'll read from the closing, where I think I'm reading through Williams's work and through Du Bois's work toward the kind of critical gesture I think is necessary, not only in criticism generally, but maybe in the kind of criticism we need at the moment. This is from the final few paragraphs of that piece. In his 1936 proposal for the Black Man and the Wounded World, Du Bois suggested that Jim Crow was the precursor and ultimate model for the forms of management and exploitation that European colonizers exercised in Africa and Asia. He planned a book that would begin with the quote unquote scramble for Africa, then shift to examine Negroes in America, narrating a story about, quote, the extraordinary interaction of war and race prejudice, end quote. Finally, in the book's third section, Du Bois would address the aftermath of the First World War and its historical and political legacy. According to his manuscript notes, Du Bois plotted the final chapters as a summary of the factual material brought together in this study. It would be an analysis of the volatility of the global economy and the recklessness of the imperial system, starting with Africa and African labor, illustrating, quote, the possible future from that point of view. But it would also present a study of war which shall be a tract for peace. In one of the final grant applications he submitted for the project, Du Bois described his book as a history of global warfare and the tragedy of racial colonialism. Quote, the whole prospect of war in the future is thus largely bound up with the results of the World War upon these darker races, end quote. We might read this as one of Du Bois's moments of prophetic political scientific thought about late 20th and 21st century geopolitics. Had he completed the book, Williams argues, the Black Man in the Wounded World, quote, promised to be truly path-breaking, end quote. But World War II made the project's completion impossible. Preparations for that Second World War exposed just how much America and the world had failed to learn the lessons of the First World War. Denied research support, Du Bois recognized that the Black Man in the Wounded World would not be realized. Williams calls this unfinished manuscript a failure, but in light of his patient, beautifully scripted elucidation of Du Bois's project and how its development fueled the scholar's exceptional publication catalog, 1915 to 1940, I wonder if that failed book deserves another label. Perhaps we ought to imagine The Black Man in the Wounded World as a Pan-African passagen work after Walter Benjamin's own failed book from the same period. A global political history under Du Bois's hand from 1884 to 2024. After all, with their deep, continual, and ongoing incursions throughout the Caribbean, the Polynesian archipelagos, across the Middle Eastern, Central American, and Asian landmasses, and on the African and South American continents, China, Europe, the US, and Russia prove that Du Bois's arguments about the color line, economic colonialism, and global forever wars are both contemporary and evidential. Thank you.
Following three geniuses, this was really heartening to hear all of these thoughts in succession. There seems to be quite a bit of overlap about the intersection between race and class, which is really a question of who gets allowed to tell certain stories. So the first question I'd like to ask the panel at large is, how does one create a space for oneself to write honestly but also fearlessly? I know that's a huge way to start this thing.
Well, I think the fearlessly is tricky because we're always working to be fearless, and we are always working to be to keep redefining our sense of honesty, because it always requires more. It always requires more. I mean, I grew up. I became acquainted with Black literature, feminist literature, queer literature when I was a young woman in the teens and 20s. Language changes, the stances that I took then, they haven't, reversed themselves, but they need they need me to be vulnerable and curious in ways that you can get a little settled in ways that are humbling. Let me put it that way. Um, I would say also very frankly, the level of your fight, of your struggle, which is internal and external, is also going to depend on who you are writing for. You simply are going to get censored more in certain publications, and you're going to have to decide what to do about that than in others. When I left Newsweek, I deliberately started writing for places like The Nation and The Voice because I wanted to experience for myself what it would be like not to be censored or to censor myself in advance. So, because that was somehow a little more bearable than being censored by someone I didn't respect. So, it's continual, it's ongoing. It's constructing a new, not a new, but it's reconstructing your ethical system and your aesthetics and your writing all the time in response to what's going on in the world around you and inside you.
I just thank you for that. I I feel like I just want to follow up with a pushback against the idea that I should be writing fearlessly. Um,
Thank you.
Yeah,
Keep going, keep going.
yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, I like that.
because I think if there's not something at stake for what I'm writing, if I'm not a little
A
afraid,
little
maybe
afraid.
even a lot afraid about the truth that I'm sharing, the honesty that I'm sharing, the perspective that I'm sharing, which is sometimes antagonistic or at least kind of in a different step against some ideas that have been made to be thought of as normative. Like that's scary to speak truth to power, to uh, write about parts of life, culture, self that are not often revealed. And I think maybe the question for me is always how can I continue to write despite the fear and
Yeah,
figure out how to utilize that fear effectively as opposed to trying to silence it.
I like it. I like I like that a lot. Yeah.
I'm probably scared to death every time I sit down to write.
Yeah.
And so I think I'm writing out of several several fears, just to build on Camille's idea that the writing is difficult itself. I just have finished Soil. For those of you who have not read it, it's genius. It's brilliant. It's inspiring because I think, and Margo was referencing this in her own response, that we're constantly trying to build, I think, personal libraries where we're drawing not only technical aesthetic lessons, but also, lessons about forms of bravery, whether it's about the individual sentence or, as Camille writes about, in the middle of the pandemic at this, heightened moment, getting a major prize to support the work, and then suddenly becoming a homeschool teacher. There's pain and rage and anger and fear that the thing that you're about to put down is going to get stifled by the Times, by editorial voices, by the slow creep of domestic matters. I worry, I'm sure we all have this bad habit, we're all writers here, of sitting at home and saying, okay, now it's time to get going. Well, let me clean the kitchen first. And cleaning the kitchen always then leads to laundry, taking out the trash, so on. And maybe you're writing sentences in that moment, but I think underneath all of that kind of procrastination for me is trying to like identify the particular, I think both political desire I'm trying to write toward, artistic kind of goal that I might have that I'm trying to reach. And then I'm also trying to deal with, again, what Margo was suggesting about all the obstacles to speaking truthfully to the moment and to those holding power, the fear that they're going to clip your wings or clip your voice. But you know, the great, well, maybe not so great, but the former football coach Herm Edwards once said that you play the game to win. So the only way to dismantle certain kinds of systems is actually to take the risk to put the line down itself.
That's really great. And it made me think, 'cause I also thought about Margo's comments about writing, and we've all been through it, where you're at a publication and you know you have your voice or your line and you have to kind of contract a bit and then like submit to sort of the house style, and how do you negotiate that. So in terms of, we're talking about where criticism is headed, I wonder the role and function that magazines and journals have in this, what they could be doing differently to promote, I guess, a more honest or a more like fair criticism, speaking to power the way that Walton had mentioned in his comments.
I mean, I guess to begin with, you have to have the kind of editor who's willing to let you take those risks, right? I'll just shout out, because I saw some of those panelists come in the room. There was a great panel right before ours, or there are actually two great panels on criticism, taking up many of the same topics we're talking about today, including one, I think he's sitting a few rows in, Joseph Salvatore, who edits at The Rail. And he convened 4 of his regular critics who all have different kinds of approaches and are driven by different kinds of impulses. But I think one of the things I heard them speak about was that they have confidence to take certain kinds of risks because they have an editor who not only believes in their writing as such, but expects them to take those kinds of risks. And you know, the Brooklyn Rail is a special kind of publication against let's say, the more legacy or elite institutions where risk-taking may not be as favorably held. And I suppose that is, I think, one of the challenges for this, for the next quarter of the 21st century is, can we develop a more robust kind of, let's say, arts journalistic community where there are the kinds of spaces where people can take intellectual risks in criticism without fear of penalization. You know, this goes back to your comments from 2018 and the way that there's a particular kind of sameness happening in the legacy spaces, and those spaces are meant to represent the culture as a whole, but that seems to be a failure. So how do we create more parity between the legacy spaces and those, let's say, the works in the tradition of the nation or the Village Voice, as Margo pointed us toward, where you can write differently, you can write longer, you can say the kinds of things that you might not be able to say in Newsweek or wherever.
Yeah, I think also it's really a matter of reaching towards new voices which often means not the people who we might think of as literary critics, but seeking articles and essays and feedback from people who are more typically practicing artists, who are known as the writers or the poets, as opposed to the critics. Because that's what we do in order to be a poet or a writer. You've got to be thinking often very, very critically and carefully about your community, the legacy that you've come from, etc. But you not necessarily have thought of yourself as a critic. And
Mm,
so, if editors do a better job of tapping a wider selection of people, a surprising selection of people, and then helping support folks as they figure out how to write into a genre that feels new to them, I think it gets very exciting when we have those kinds of broader voices and opportunities. I think as a professor, to me, one of the interesting things is encouraging students who I feel are particularly savvy, and helping them find their ways towards places where they can place some of their work, and just encouraging new
yeah.
generations in that way. That's a really great thing that we can do as professors. Um,
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And the students I find who are most interested are very attuned to criticism as a fluid and flexible genre, to a range of tones, to authority as a idea, as a notion, as a practice to be questioned, to be constantly redefined, as ambiguity being something to really work with. So it's partly demonstrating as teachers and as editors, but very much as editors and publishers, that we want this range, that criticism, this thing we call criticism, is not static, it's mutable. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad we're talking about academia because I feel like we all teach, and that's the other institution other than like the legacy media that I think most critics will like wind up intersecting with. And I do think that criticism has a role in academia. Um, Outside of encouraging students, though, I wonder what academia can do to better support criticism and not just maintaining like siloed and sort of the academic criticism. Like, how do we encourage people to be more like public facing with these fluid works that we're talking about?
Well, are you talking about writing programs, MFAs,
Um,
or academic ones? You can certainly find certain shut lockdowns in MFA programs too, meaning certain writers, certain styles are decreed popular and others aren't. But those are different challenges in some ways than academic programs where people are using very, very specific discourses.
right, there's the difference between like a PhD and like an MFA.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Um,
So I'm not, yeah, both
I
of
guess
them
more
are
so
challenging.
PhD programs. 'Cause I do think nonfiction programs they're starting to become more. My program at SASC, we didn't genre tracks. You kind of like write whatever. I do think there's starting some openness to that. I guess I was more talking about like PhD programs.
Well, Walton, you know a lot about that.
Yeah, I happen to be teaching a graduate course right now, a practicum on criticism, and the class itself is fascinating. These are new graduate students who, I guess I'll just say we're reading. We started out the semester by reading John Guillory's book, Professing Criticism, that had a lot of buzz around it last year. And maybe one of the strong elements of that work, and there's some I think there's some problems with some of the assumptions that he makes there, but one of the strong elements of the work is that it offers a history of criticism and a history of the English department and a history of criticism in the English department. And, you know, it's been unstable since criticism entered the English department because that particular section of humanities studies used to be driven by rhetoric and philology. And when close reading, and there are two versions here to think of, both in the UK and the one that the modernist practice of the fugitives and the Vanderbilt School, when that came into vogue, there was resistance in English departments because of the tradition of rhetoric and philology. What Terry Eagleton says in The Function of Criticism is that criticism ran aground in the 1960s at the very moment when women, people of color, queer people started agitating for representation on reading lists. Among other things, this might mean that the culture wars we talk about, or the canon wars we used to talk about, took up much of the 20th century. All of this stuff is really useful to understand, I think, even in the undergraduate classroom, to say that there actually isn't a standard. There actually isn't a fixed form. If we imagine this, and I'll reference the earlier panel again, where there was some discussion of Walter Benjamin and the instruction he got from one of his compatriots was that you're going to have to turn criticism into a genre so that genre is renewable, right? Think about this in terms of jazz traditions. You're improvising out of the history of that tradition in order to take it to new places. I think that's what our strongest critics are frequently doing. So I don't see that is a thing that should be separate from what it means to do deep research and produce a monograph. In fact, I think one of the things that's happening among younger scholars is that they're starting to write criticism that looks a lot like creative nonfiction. I'll just cite one book, for instance, Dreams in Double Time by Jonathan Liao, a new board member coming on for the NBCC. It's not only a rigorous and brilliant book, it's beautifully written, so it's fun to read. And it's the kind of criticism that after you put it down, you're like, well, I'm different now.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really great, and I love that book, and I'm really glad that he's coming on the board. I think a lot too about how, Walton, you were talking about how showing different ways of living via criticism. And it's really a lot to think about. I wonder if it's viable. Not that people don't want to do it, but I guess how do you maintain, or we as critics maintain our sense of independence when you're trying to write criticism, but oftentimes the discourse ends up staging out this sort of binary in the discourse. How do you maintain your sense of independence when it seems like a lot of the legacy media in particular wants to have the same back and forth conversation?
Well, I'll quickly cite three things and then let Camille and Margo come in. First thing I'll cite in terms of the kind of piece that after I read it, I had to reevaluate a whole series of thoughts. I can't think of the title of the essay off the top of my head, but it's Daryl Pinckney's review of Thomas Chatterton Williams's most recent book. And at the end of the piece, after hewing very closely to the book as such, Pinckney makes a turn, and in that turn, he basically says, if you, and it reminds me of this great moment at the end of, near the end of Toni Morrison's Jazz, where Golden Gray has come upon his father and basically says, I don't want to be a free black man, I want to be a free man. And his father in response, and this is what Pinckney seems to be saying also to Williams, is, well, if you're going to be black, be all the way black. Mm-hmm. If you don't want to be black, move on. And I dare say I haven't seen a critic challenge a writer in that fashion. And Williams is the kind of writer who goes after some of his critics on Twitter. Williams had nothing to say to Pinckney in that moment. And that's one gesture of saying, here's how a critic can kind of tackle a subject and a particular author in a manner that is feisty and forthright. Then I'll point to the books of my co-panelists and say that on one hand, Constructing a Nervous System is a model for taking one's long-term critical efforts and refining them, reshaping them into a personal narrative, and discovering in that act that not only has your mind changed, one's mind can change, but also that one might discover about oneself that newness is happening regularly. And that newness is happening by taking on different guises and trying on different ways of being. Then I might say that what Reading Soil has done for me most recently is given me the kind of text where I can put that Margo Jefferson lesson to work in my own experience, where I have to think about what this last set of 4 years has actually meant. I'm sure we're all struggling with that in various ways, and so Soil becomes a model for how one might put on another mask and re-describe a particular moment in order to understand who any individual person might have been during that same period. So I think those are examples where critical works actually do the work of forcing us to engage in our own lives and actually maybe change our lives.
Well, it's lovely to be praised so by you, Walton. One thing I used to often say to myself, and this is connected to what we've just been saying, particularly if I had been assigned a book or had chosen a book that it wasn't taking life in my mind, and I would quote that line from Ellison's criticism: "Change the joke and slip the yoke." And whether it was a joke or not, or some terribly serious shift, you change the context. You do assume another persona, another guise. One thing that the legacy publications so often do is they diversify subject matters. Oh, we're covering so many people of color in these stories, and here, look at how many artists of color we profile, but the approach tends to be the same over and over. You spoke, I think, Justin, of the usual binaries. Well, how do you write a piece where you're in fact saying, those aren't holding here? Sometimes it's got to be very forthright, and sometimes, it's more it's subtler. It's more of an ambush from of style, of tone, of whatever. But it's very definitely change the joke and slip the yoke.
And I think it's worthwhile to think about, we keep using the legacy media here, but even legacy media understands that we need to be thinking about multiple platforms
Yes,
and
they do.
ways that we are talking about the world. And so, how are we utilizing visual components, digital components, social media? Like, how is that? How are the many complex components of our individual lives showing up in what we're writing about when we're writing criticism? Because if
Hmm.
it's not a fully engaged
Mhm.
critical view,
Yeah.
it doesn't feel useful to
Or
me and to
enjoyable
many
to write.
readers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So many readers really they want to have complex multifaceted conversations about the the world. And as writers who are thinking about engaging critically with cultural understandings of the world, we have to be doing that in our work as well. And so that's one way I feel like a lot of criticism has shifted away from some of the traditions from um let's say the 80s or 90s or before that, because they end up looking the books end up looking very very different, or the essays look very very different in their genres and in their applications and the ways they present the material, and we have to be able to move with that
Yeah.
shift.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about. I have two immediate thoughts. Like, I guess the first one, because we keep bringing up, it's like legacy media, and the reason why is because that's where most people like are aspiring to publish, whether it be like the New Yorker, or like the Nation, or whatever. But I also see all of these other communities coming up, like journals or like spaces for criticism online, um, popping up in response to not being able to get into that space. So, and this is like probably too huge of a question for the time we have left, but is criticism moving away, like slowly, at least away from legacy media? I know like there's a lot of writers who I really like and read regularly who don't write as much anymore in like magazines, and like it's all entirely on Substack, and I thought that was like
Yeah.
a really interesting trend.
That's happening for sure. Yeah. In the, decades ago, it was the little magazines,
Yeah,
the
right.
downtown alternative. Now, yeah, it's Substack or it's, yeah, for sure. People are also using, even if they don't want to admit it, they're using Instagram in interesting ways, actually. Yeah, very definitely. They are also still using you know what, but
Yeah,
we won't speak of it.
yeah,
X, right.
yeah, right. X'd out.
Yeah. But sure that's happening. Yeah. And that's feeding this sense, okay, I can try all manner of things and I can consider objects, experiences, as some form of art, of cultural excitement. They're broadening the field of what one can write about, and as a critic, and that's great.
I suppose that the challenge with, and Substack makes sense, right? Because it's already designed for subscription. But I mean, built into your question is the question of how the critic makes a living.
The thing, yeah, right.
All of us teach.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
And
we all
that I think that's a probably a historical, you know, circumstance, right? You need to have a day job unless you're plugged in as a staff writer at a particular place. And I
I'm
find
open to
myself.
corporate sponsorship.
What's that?
I said I'm open to corporate sponsorship if anybody's interested.
Here I am.
Yeah. Yeah, I am wearing Todd Snyder, if there are any, you know. But I think I think that's an important concern, because as we're bringing up, you know, the legacy newspapers, for instance, you know, just in the last, 6 weeks, Washington Post, the LA Times, and then in the magazine world, you know, editorial, I just saw this before our panel, the current editor of Rolling Stone is stepping down, you know, the Condé Nast protests, so on. That marketplace, if you will, is fracturing. And just like in academia, what those of us who are moving between these worlds are learning is that the people who have been claiming to understand how the economics of these spaces operate don't really know. And so it makes sense that I think either individual critics or groups of editors, editorial teams are deciding to create venues that are adjacent to the mainstream. But again, the same problem is going to creep up eventually in terms of like how to offer writers a sustainable existence via their production. I hear chuckling over here, I think, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we haven't even talked about the money yet. Maybe that'll be for the questions,
Yeah.
Q&A. But the second thing I thought of was what I think I like about all the panelists here is that the personal is treated as critical. It's not just like reviewing like the work or reviewing, and maybe it never is, but I think the people here think a little more creatively about how their personhood is like impacted by what they're like exposed to or what's under review. And it's been great like discussing and like learning all this from you. I think,
Well, if I may, I
yes.
feel like one of the issues there is that when I was coming up as a student and a young writer, there was so much talk about this question that was brought up early in this panel about um, who is the universal, who has a universal voice,
Yes.
and
Yeah. Oh,
who
yeah.
has this marginalized voice. And like the moment that fallacy gets exposed, it feels imperative that everybody brings their individual perspective forward, so then that helps to shape how it is and why it is that I am responding. And there's not a way to honestly say that I have any sort of universal grasp on the world. And it's just then useful to understand what my perspectives and biases and hopes are, and to just bring that out right away into the work so it's open.
Yeah, that's like a great way of describing. Like it's just a sense of openness, openness to the world, and just openness, being open to the idea that your personhood has value and that you can seeing through your eyes has value, which I think is very like hard, but very like hardening to claim.
Yeah, that's one of the things one fears, one struggles.
Yeah, right.
With fears about, right? Yeah.
Why don't we take, I guess, some questions from the audience for about 10, 15 minutes or so, and then we'll...
Does someone have a microphone?
Yes, sorry, I see you in the back toward the left.
Is there a microphone?
Yes. That's a really good question.
Why don't you, I don't know if they heard it on there. Why don't you repeat it?
Oh, sorry, the question was, has the audience changed for the audience for literary criticism? Or what is,
No. He has one over there. I'll go get the microphone. Go ahead.
yeah, has the audience for literary criticism changed? Or is the audience changing for literary criticism?
What kind? Short reviews, short snappy reviews, New York Review of Books, long, somber. There are a fair number of kinds now.
Yeah, that's a good point as well.
And readers silo themselves with their favorite critics and their favorite forms, even, music magazine or film. Yeah.
But I do believe that the audience has changed because the writers have changed and expanded. They're like a writer like a Hanifa Diraqib, like what Hanif brings to literary and cultural criticism is fresh and new, and who he
Absolutely.
brings to the work is different because of that. I could go through a number of different people who I think
He
are
also
have
brings,
changed the conduits because of who's coming to read the work
I
that they're
think
writing.
that's true. And he also ranges from, very small, almost private spaces to, okay, here's my New York Times essay. He does all of that. Then their books, their poems. So the audience is widening. I don't know, is it fully changing? Or is it
That's an
also,
interesting question. What does change mean, right? Is the
yeah.
sort of is the interest or concerns of people similar? It's just the skins in which the people come has changed. Does that mean the audience has changed, or
Yeah.
just that it's broadened? Yeah.
Sure.
Sorry, is the
There you go.
Oh, okay. I guess this is just a follow-up question about audience, because I'm thinking if the personal is inherently political and then most artistic production is inherently personal, like all memoirs kind of have critical capacities, or even if the personal is political and the personal is art, then even fiction and poetry and movies, they all are inherently. So I guess my question is, with criticism itself being so genre bending, are there elements of literary criticism in genres that aren't considered literary criticism? Or it's almost like Inception. Like, are we sort of forcing everyone to engage with criticism constantly? So isn't the audience just everyone all of the time always? Or would that be a good thing?
the question is just to understand
We could actually hear it this
We
time.
heard it, yeah.
Okay.
And I would say that I think that has actually always been the case. I can, there's so many books that I love that are actually, books of fiction, as you say, or books of poetry, or this is beautiful poem in Robert Haas's newest book, Sierra Snow, and the poem's called Modern Poetry, and it's just this kind of critical list of modern poets and what they did and how they how they affected how we all do what we do. And it's a poem, it's a beautiful poem, but it's also this
Yeah.
incredible, like, could be a forward to to an anthology of modern poetry. So I think that's always been something that some writers have engaged with. And of course, what the sort of complicated ecumenical nature of the nonfiction genre means
Yeah.
that particularly not creative nonfiction, memoir, autobiography, those all have the capacity and oftentimes the necessity to engage with literary and cultural criticism in order to forward whatever personal or community message is happening. Because think of like a bell hooks, for instance. Like what is Bell Hooks doing other than literary and cultural criticism? A lot. She's also doing a lot of other things, and yet those books could definitely always fall in that category. I think that that's why that judge in the beginning, that I mentioned in the beginning, was in a sense so confounded by
Yeah.
what even that category meant, because it's so capacious as to almost be the label becoming irrelevant. But that doesn't
Criticism,
feel
yeah.
like a bad thing to me. That feels like a invitation
Yeah.
to innovation.
Agreed. Agreed. I just do want to say quickly, the personal is, and I'm not sure the personal is always inherently political. I think we really all, as readers, writers, whatever, we have to feel and think and sense our way to those connections. I think my generation in particular could be a little smug about it. If I am sincere about what I'm saying personally, then it is political. Well, often it is, but often your language, your thinking more deeply, the form you pick is really what's going to bring it out for your readers and so that they can really feel those connections. I absolutely agree with Camille. Even those old slightly stuffy forms like the essay novel, or documentary poetry, they're all, or the fairly new one, the lyric essay, they are all acknowledging and gesturing to these amalgams.
Yeah, those are wonderful answers. I'm so sorry. I think we're out of time. We're going to be hanging out at the book table, though. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to come up and talk to us. But one more round of applause for our panelists: Margo Jefferson, Camille Dungy, Walton Muyumba. Thank you. Absolute honor.
Thank you. It was an
everyone.
honor. Yeah, very
Thank
much.
you.
Absolute honor to be with
Enjoy your
you. Thank you.
AWP.
It's just
Have
such a pleasure.
fun, people. The evening is young. Have
Yeah,
fun.
yeah. Only 5 o'clock Central.
There we go.
Wow.